raising those issues with a number of housing providers today. We'll encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtags Assembly Housing and Housing After Grenfell. This is part of our work following up on issues raised by the Grenfell disaster. First, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we get to our guests. And also, can you make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode so that we don't get any interruptions? And that's for people in the audience too. Can I ask the clerk if any apologies have been received?
Thank you. We've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Devonish and Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member Ishlomi will be substituting.
Thank you. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Can I ask our members to note the list of appointments set out in item 2 and ask if you have any additional interest to declare? No, thank you. Item 3 is the minutes. Can we agree the minutes from our previous meeting held on the 5th of June 2018?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the outstanding list of actions from previous meetings? Agreed. Thank you. And right, on to item 5. This is our main discussion item on resident involvement. And so can I welcome our guests. We're expecting the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development to come and join us slightly later. Can I welcome Alan Storrar, who is the Housing Policy Manager for the Housing and Land Department in the Greater London Authority. We have David Burns, who is the Head of Housing Strategy for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. We have Simon Latham, who is the Assistant Director for Environment, Housing and Regeneration in the London Borough of Sutton. We have Steve Tucker, who is the Managing Director of the Sutton Housing Partnership.
That's right.
Which is an ALMO. And we have Michael Storrar, who is the Strategic Director for Housing and Modernisation in the London Borough of Southwark. We have Paul Hackett, who is the Chief Executive of the Optivo Housing Association, also Chair of the G15. And Simon Theobald, who is the Head of Customer Engagement at Metropolitan Housing Association. So between all of you, you represent quite a number of residents of London. One thing we want to talk about is the problems that residents raised with us in terms of the day-to-day management of the housing stock. So I want to address my first questions to David Burns and then Simon Latham and Michael Storrar, if that's okay, who are from London boroughs. What we want to know is how do you pay for and organise resident involvement in your boroughs? Does the money come from the rents? Do you subsidise it? And what strategies do you use to involve residents?
So on the funding side of things, yeah, it all comes from the rents. It's all contained within the housing revenue account. So the team that we've got is 8 strong, so it's a fairly large resident engagement team. And so the council at Hammersmith has a kind of strong principle of doing things with residents rather than to them, so it was quite important for the administration that they had a really strong and well-resourced resident involvement team. In terms of the structure, it's quite broad-based, so there's borough-wide forums which fulfil a scrutiny role, but also an information and sharing role and a service testing, service improvement role. So there's a borough forum which happens quarterly, which is the opportunity for residents, officers and council members to engage on specific topics, but also to then have more broader based discussions. There's then also a housing representatives forum which meets 7 or 8 times a year, which is the forum for elected TRA members to then get together as a group and represent themselves collectively to council officers. And that's a kind of accountability scrutiny function as much as anything. So they review the performance of the various contracts that the council has as a housing service. So our repairs contractor, Mighty, will turn up to those meetings to be held to account for their performance and talk about their service improvement. We have one outsourced housing management area with Pinnacle services, They attend that meeting, and then the housing officers and the repairs and capital team also come to those meetings. Below that, then we have the tenants and residents associations, which I think kind of have a couple of different roles for the council. So they're partly about accountability, but they're also about the link with local democracy. So the councillors and the TRAs have a fundamental role in those, and the on-the-ground kind of relationship between local councillors and residents is one of the main functions there, as well as the kind of an early warning system for officers. So if the council does something that for all its good intentions might not have gone down with residents, the TRA is often the first point that will put its hand up and say, you've made a mistake here, you need to sort it out. So that's kind of one of their kind of really useful functions. But then at the same time, we also then have lots of specific panels for different functions that are about the services, so more about quality assurance. So we have what we call a reading group, which is a virtual group where if the council is about to put out something, a standard communication, or for example, our Section 20 notices to leaseholders, before publishing those, we put them through the reading group. The reading group fed back, actually you need to change the way that you're talking about this because it didn't actually make much sense to a layperson. So that's quite a useful service improvement function. Doesn't actually take that much resource because it's all virtual. And then we use estate inspections and mystery shopping. So there's a kind of wide variety of then quality assurance and improvement methods that we use.
Thank you. That's really useful. That's quite a traditional model then of using TRAs. Do TRAs, they can apply for grants? They're funded to work. Is that right?
Yeah, they are. So there's the resident engagement team supports them directly to get themselves set up and governed. They're kind of supposed to be self-organising once that's established, and they have annual general meetings and they have elections, but supported by the officers. They can also apply for grants for their estate, so improvement grants, estate grants, but also for events and activities. There's a small pool of grants. And actually most TRAs do take advantage of that. So every year there are, on the larger estates generally, kind of summer events, summer festivals that are supported by the engagement team. And so that's one of the functions that they play.
And do you have a specific levy that you put into the rents, or is it just included within that?
I think there was, but it's now just kind of subsumed within the rent.
Okay, so, thank you. So moving on to Simon Latham from Sutton. Do you want to outline what you do?
Yeah, so we too fund through the housing revenue account. There isn't a specific levy, to pick up your last question. Much of our work is done in partnership with Sutton Housing Partnership, our ALMA. I'll just say a word about a review we carried out. So like most London boroughs, we've taken the opportunity to look at whether the ALMO model is the right model. Between 2016 and the end of 2017, residents were fully involved in that review, and the view of our residents and the view of our members was that we should retain a remodelled ALMO, and Steve can add more to what he's been doing in that context. On one level, we too have a traditional model. We have 8 tenant resident associations. They are supported to bid for other resources from other channels. But I think the key message we would expect all staff involved in frontline housing services to convey is resident involvement is everybody's business. So we don't have a very large dedicated team. We've reflected through recent what we term boot camps on what residents tell us are their top priorities. The next event is next Saturday, the 7th of July, and we're really driven by what they are telling us are their top priorities. So one of those priorities is no surprise, repairs, generally always the top of residents' list of priorities. SHP have already established a repairs transformation board where residents are involved in overseeing improvements with our repairs contractor MEAs. The other areas they highlighted are some are familiar, but some are perhaps a surprise to us. Out of hours service delivery, for example. was one of their top 6 themes. Interesting that they've highlighted that. So diverting us towards looking in more detail at what most needs improvement in those areas. We too use a resident reading panel for scrutinising documents before they're sent out to residents. We recently discussed, last Wednesday in fact, consulting residents about frequently asked questions they have in the context of fire safety. So rather than us producing a leaflet which we think mirrors the kind of issues which residents would have questions about, we're going to take soundings from involved residents to check what they are most interested in and what is concerning them and their neighbours most. We do have 2 borough-wide structures, Sutton Federation and Tenant Resident Associations and the Sutton Leaseholders Association. And I think one key theme of both bodies is actually in making estates communities where people are proud to live. Everyone has an interest in that, including the tenants of absentee landlords, which of course is an increasing issue across London and often, in our experience, can lead to some of the more intractable antisocial behaviour challenges we face. And not surprisingly, going back to the 6 themes that residents have highlighted through the boot camp, antisocial behaviour is one of those 6, probably the top housing management theme of those 6. So we are probably in what I would term a phase of transition from a more traditional model. That won't mean we'll move away from supporting TRAs where they exist, and we'll certainly want to sustain them and create more where there is a resident desire to set one up. But actually what we are seeking to do is to find out through people who don't normally think of attending meetings, don't perhaps have the time to commit to attending regular meetings, how we can feed their views in. So going back to the review we carried out between 2016 and 17, the prelude to that was some independently commissioned research into the views of residents about what they think is good, what they think is less good, what most needs improvement across the borough, reaching a pretty significant sample, probably about 25% of the overall tenant and leasehold. That's a good question, one that we haven't explicitly taken up with our TRAs. But I think the short answer is I think they should be involved.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
I just echo some of the observations Simon's made. Sutton Housing Partnership manages Sutton Council's housing stock on their behalf. We're going through this period of transformation following the review, remodelling the Almo. We've moved to smaller housing patches, and the intention behind that is very much to mainstream resident engagement, and in fact to mainstream our engagement with residents, putting it that way. We want to build up and develop the trust, mutual trust and confidence between housing managers and the residents who live there. I think we see our overarching mission as enabling social housing residents to lead successful lives and take the opportunities that are out there. And resident engagement and having that connectivity is part of that. So good health and living in well-connected communities is fundamental to taking the opportunities that are there. We're trying to forge a new relationship with and really get to know our residents, so understand what their challenges are in their lives and help point them towards solutions. So our operating model and the smaller patch sizes are designed to allow housing managers the time to do this and develop that relationship. I think the other point I'd like to make is there's a focus on resident engagement from the point of view of safety and compliance following Grenfell. I think the important issue of health inequalities and where you live being a big determinant of that, of how long you live and how healthy you are, is an important issue for social housing providers. And there's a lot we can do through resident engagement to address that. And that I feel that is becoming a priority for landlords and what we do.
Thank you very much. I mean, certainly one of the things we had back from resident feedback at our forum was they didn't always feel like they were regarded as the experts in their own homes, and that sounds from what you're saying that you're moving back towards more regarding their expertise as being important, which is
yes, they as the service they are the service experts, and it's a relationship of equals rather than professional to client. I think that model and the detachment that goes with that professionalism is not well regarded by residents, so we need to change it.
Thank you. That's definitely what we were hearing. Can we move on to Michael now from Southwark? How does Southwark manage things and pay for them?
Thanks. Well, we also have quite a traditional model which we have been consulting our residents about, and we're looking to make some changes as well. So rather than going into the great detail, it's very similar to the one that was set out, I've forgotten your name, sorry, but from Hammersmith and Fulham. But what we found is last year we conducted a large survey, spoke to over 1,000 of our residents, and got feedback from many more. And we think that only about 0.5% of the council's tenants and homeowners actively participate in those traditional TRAs and the forums that we've got. So we have that feeds up through a structure, and we've got a borough-wide organisation. We also have specific groups, again in a kind of fairly traditional sort of structure for our leaseholders and freeholders as well. But that only tells really a very small part of the picture. So we've been in recent years looking to reach out and adopt new ways of getting participation. We had something called the Southwark Conversation, which engaged over 3,000 residents right across the council, but council housing is so big in Southwark, many people from Southwark were involved. And as I say, over 1,000 of our tenants and leaseholders were involved. And so we've used a whole range of methods, from street stalls, digital engagement. We've had something, I'm going to mispronounce this, but whatever is the talk version of a karaoke, we have one of those. Talkioke, it says here, but all very exciting stuff. We've been working with youth radio and young advisors, and the big gap is that our age profile for the more formal structure is completely out of kilter with the age, the demographic on our estates. So we really know that we have to reach out and engage with younger people because they are massively underrepresented, in fact barely represented at all. We've also been considerably upping our game online. So last year we had over 15,000 responses through online, so through our engagement, what we call our engagement hub, on over 100 different consultations. That was a 75% increase from the previous year. So that's increasing a lot, and of course people want to use and do use their mobile phones increasingly to access services and to let us know what they think. And clearly residents themselves are already organised into Facebook groups and other groups to share information between them, so we need to be and are engaging with that. Our resident services officers spend approximately 80% of their time out on estates. So I think my colleague here was talking about actually it's every day. It's how we expect people and how people do work who work for Southwark. So talking to people just in the course of their everyday work, being seen on estates, really whatever their job is, making sure that they engage with residents and listen to them. And then we've got a good method for getting that information and feeding back and explaining to people what we've done with it. I should just say also that Southwark has got, I don't know if you've had this in a previous briefing, but we've got 17 tenant management organisations.
That's actually a further question, so if you want to answer it now, I mean, yeah, you have a very large number of TMOs.
We do, they manage between them, they manage over 4,500 properties. So that's probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the country. And I think we've got the only self-funding tenant management organisation that's actually has done some housing development. So
JCB.
Sorry?
Leathermark.
That's correct.
Yes.
That's absolutely right. So I was down looking at the property recently, some some former garages being demolished, and got some very nice flats going up.
And I went there the other day as well, see how it was coming along.
Great views as well. So a lot is going on. I think you asked a specific question about funding. It all comes from the housing revenue account, so that's tenants' rents. We have some specific money that's earmarked for tenants' own use. Some of that goes by way of bidding into a grant. Some of it goes by way of small amounts of money that TRAs can bid for to spend on their own estate. So we try to devolve quite a bit of the decisions and spending for fairly small stuff, but it's the kind of things that people say make a big difference to them. So what the grounds look like, small things like where bike racks might go, small improvements on estates. So we do a lot of that. And finally, just to say that we're just kicking off a process that, following up last year's review, to appoint or select a group of residents who are going to take us through the next stage of looking again at what the formal structure might be like. Because, as I said at the beginning, if only 0.5% of all of our tenants and residents are actively engaged in that, we're missing out on an enormous number of voices. And we do include in that all residents, so whether they are actual tenants or the tenants of leaseholders, so people who live on our estate and form parts of the community, they're the voices that we want to hear from.
Thank you very much. Just a question about patch size, I suppose is the right word. You said that you have resident support officers who are out on estates. How many residents approximately would each cover? How many households?
I don't actually know the answer to that, so I won't make it up.
Okay. If you could tell us that later,
but
that
I can certainly send that
to
in
know.
to. Yeah, I can send that in just to be accurate about it.
Yeah, and I guess the same question to Steve Tucker, who mentioned that as well, that you're reducing patch size. What are you reducing it to?
It's gone down from just under 1,000, and that was clearly very difficult for housing managers to get to know their tenants, to just over 400. So we're looking to mainstream resident engagement through that and use the reduction in patch sizes to make that happen. Probably got some way to go to allow us, particularly to do the annual tenancy visit that we're planning as part of that offer to residents, and to ensure that for vulnerable residents they get enough housing manager time to address their needs.
David, just come back to you. Do you know the number of households each of your housing officers will cover?
It's between 400 and 500.
Okay, so that's still quite a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Just for the further question, in terms of TRAs, I mean, you all seem to have a more or less traditional model where you make use of TRAs. They're elected in the normal way, democratically on each estate. Michael, you're the only one who's set out any limitations of that model. Is that something, are you trying to address any limitations?
Limitations, I mean, we talk about representativeness. I think that's the first limitation. I mean, there isn't particularly a representative, if you like, representation threshold. It's willing volunteers, often. I think our view is where even if there's a minority of residents who want to sustain those formal bodies, we will support them, recognising their limitations, essentially as representatives. So we have to find other channels, which is really where the locality-based model of working, being closer to tenants on a day-to-day basis comes in. So that's probably the major limitation.
Our TRAs do some fantastic things. They're great at kind of helping communities bind together, and many of them have halls, and loads of activities go on there, and they organise a whole host of things that it's really sensible to let residents get on with and do, and we want to encourage that. But it's not the best method for finding out what everybody thinks about all the issues that are really important on the estates. And we've certainly found that we've very sadly recently had some dreadful stabbing and criminal activity. And the TRAs, I think that's been outside of something that I've been really able to grapple with very well. So we certainly think that we need to do, and we are doing other things outside of the TRA structure, but we think that they're great things to have as well, but perhaps for other reasons.
David?
Yeah, I think the representation point is an important one, and I think that you have to be quite careful that they don't become exclusionary. I think there is that risk, especially with long-standing TRAs which are based on elections and how that works with the changing demographic of estates in Hammersmith. I think that's part of the role of the engagement team is managing some of those aspects of it. I think the other side of it is there's a risk that the council or the organisation puts an over-reliance on some of those individuals who are active and vocal and are trying to help but also challenge. But that then places risk on that individual in the expectation of them in the community, that they're the person to go to and they're going to solve the problem. And it's, are they supported enough to do that, and did they even sign up to do that? So I think there's those kind of limitations and weaknesses potentially. I mean, they play a really strong accountability role, so I think they're valuable in that way, but the representation always becomes a challenge.
Are you working at all to amend or improve housing officers' roles in supporting TRAs or making them more representative or more better promoted?
So the housing officers, they do have that role, I think. So they're kind of, with the engagement team are kind of the subject experts. So that's what they're there for, to kind of keep the structure going and to provide the advice and to keep residents, to help train up residents to get involved. The housing officers are actively involved in recruiting and going to the TRAs and working with them. So that is part of their role, is to be on the lookout for people who might be involved in it. But there's only so much resource they can put into it when they've got their kind of primary tenancy management role. I think there's also potentially a slight conflict in that. So we're a service provider, but the tenancy management function is also an enforcement regulation role. In some respects, you know, so they're also there to go tell somebody you need to move your bike from the lobby because it's a fire issue, a fire safety issue, or they need to deal with neighbour disputes and things like that. So it can be quite challenging for them to manage that relationship, while at the same time also the kind of positive aspect of engaging people in the service improvement and things like that. So I think it's a bit of a fine balance for the housing officers in how they actually do that.
Simon, do you have any views on that, the role of housing officers in resident engagement and maybe improving how that's done?
The transformational agenda that Steve's mentioned was to integrate functions. So we previously had a separate income team from a tenancy management team, and actually those roles are now integrated. So as you might expect, it's much more important to have a conversation early on with someone who is getting into difficulties with paying their rent and find out what's beneath that. And that's really what the new role is about. So it is that closeness to individuals, trying to find out on a sort of tenancy by tenancy basis what is driving that. On average, about a quarter of our tenants across each patch are in rent arrears. I don't know how that compares across London. That feels to me quite a high percentage. It reflects a number of factors which we won't discuss this morning. But what's important we would recognise is understanding the totality of factors that a household is facing a challenge with. So if someone is falling into arrears after a long period of paying their rent, what's behind that? It could be as straightforward as they're out of work, they've claimed universal credit, and as we all know, the 6-week, or is it now 4-week gap, creates an immediate challenge for them. There could be illness, ill health. I think that's a major theme which we've identified as significant for our tenants. Actually, as your health fails, you may face other challenges, other demands on your limited incomes, whether you're in work or out of work.
Okay, thank you. Michael, obviously a TMO is a tenant managed organisation, so they naturally have that conflict between management and representation because the residents are members. Is there anything you're doing to improve within the council the housing officers' role in engagement, and how do the TMOs handle that conflict?
Just within the council, quickly. So it's so we put, as I said, a big emphasis on our officers being out on estates, and every resident, every household will get a visit every couple of years. So someone will go around and knock on the door and see how they're getting on. And of course, we expect to see people a lot more frequently than that, but that's in their home. For the TMOs, the kind of TMOs range quite a bit. Some do everything. We mentioned leather market, and some do actually very little. They maybe just take on cleaning responsibilities. So the range of responsibilities differ. And we provide sort of a bespoke service to the TMOs depending really on the kinds of things that they are responsible for. By and large, we maintain responsibility for things like repairs, certainly major repairs, and we're always responsible for the buildings that we continue to own. The TMOs that work really well actually put an enormous emphasis on getting to know their residents. And many of them are quite, we've mentioned one that's very big, but many of them are quite small. We actually have a brand new TMO that only started this year. That's got, I think, less than 1,000 residents, so it's a very small TMO. Sorry, less than 1,000, less than 500. It's a very small TMO, and they put a lot of effort and energy into running events, having a lot of staff on site, very easy access to talk to people, just to make sure that there's a very local and responsive service. And on bigger issues, I know that leather market would be a good example of where in their development they worked very hard before they started the development to discuss with residents what they wanted to see coming out of that development, who would benefit from the new homes that were being built, how that would help relieve the overcrowding on the estate, what would happen if overcrowded found ability to have a local flexibility so that the TMO could have conversations with its residents about how I think we said there 50% would be benefiting the local, the TMO area, which is quite large.
Someone could, so for example, someone to downsize, so to someone who's overcrowded, for example, to move into a bigger property.
Yeah, exactly.
Assemblymember Boff, we've slightly crashed into your question about the roles of housing officers. So would you like to take over and finish on that before we move on to the housing association?
Anything for an easy life. You can ask my questions whenever you want. There is one question I wanted to ask. We described our consultations earlier. Do you, Mr. Storrar, does Southwark do a consultation report after it's done a consultation exercise?
Yeah, we obviously, it's important, we do go back and tell people what the outcome of the consultation has been. In fact, we've done that. Our biggest consultations would go back to Cabinet if it's a large scale one. Otherwise, we go back and just let the resident association, the tenant and resident association know. So,
but as an analysis on the consultation process itself, how many people were consulted, how many responses?
Yeah, it's quite a technical.
Who said yes, who said no?
Yeah.
And are they in the public domain? Those reports?
Yeah.
They are. And in those reports, do they, in the consultation reports, do they have the impact on decisions? Do they have a section where it says, well, this is what you said, so we changed this?
Yeah, you said we did.
Yeah. And does that apply to Hammersmith as well?
When we do major consultations, yes, we would a similar kind of process where we'd analyse that and then produce a report that explains how it was implemented.
And again, in the public domain?
If they're not on the council's website, they'll be publicly accessible.
Right. And Sutton too? Is
yes, if we do major consultations, the same. Just one added point. There's a performance committee in the ALMO which looks in detail at a range of performance issues regularly, and that would include perspectives on resident satisfaction, which is probably the most important cohort of indicators for us on a regular, monthly, quarterly basis to look at the pattern, the shifting pattern of satisfaction.
In all your three cases, you would itemise where that consultation has made an impact and analyse the impact. Is that correct?
Most of the communication to residents would be in the quarterly newsletter called Homefront, which goes to all households.
I only ask that question because a lot of concerns that I've heard from residents who may be involved in the whole consultation process often say, well, yes, we were consulted, but we don't know what happens to it, and we don't, or it comes the same. They ask the same question a year later, and we'd already answered it. That kind of thing. So it's good to know that there are those processes in place. Do you think resident involvement should be, Mr. Byrne, do you think resident involvement should be part of the housing officer's job description?
Yes and no. I think.
Great.
I think, as I was saying, I think what I said before. I think yes. I think they need to be part of that structure that is involving people on a day-to-day basis, and they need to be enabling people to involve in a way that they feel comfortable getting involved in, and their capacity and time means they can. So from formal structures to getting people to complete surveys or to take part in panels. But I think the value of having a specific team with dedicated resources to it is that means you can have a clear focus on particular topics as well as overall governance structures. That mean you can have a path of how those decisions are, how the information is consulted on, and then how those decisions are implemented, and you've got visibility around that. But then, as I think I said, the challenge, I think, from maybe this is just a local authority perspective or a Hammersmith perspective, that an element of the housing officer's role is regulation and enforcement. That's part of their job, and that's what residents want them to do.
You said earlier about how that's a different balancing act to do. Do you think actually they should be in separate? There should be separate jobs doing the bad cop and the good cop?
No, I don't think. I think because the housing officer will want to see as many residents as possible, so they'll want to be seeing residents and with different hats on, if you like. So I think they can balance that. I think it takes a kind of careful skill in order to do that successfully. I think, some people have gone in, and housing service organisations go through cycles of you have generic, you have specific, and you come back around again. I think we've got a kind of mixed approach of a kind of generic tenancy management officer who also then is involved in involvement and kind of dealing some aspects of repairs and things like that.
So Latham, do you think it should be part of the job description?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Yes is good. Mr. Storrar, should it be part of the job description?
Yeah.
So during the appraisal of the housing officer, what
you mean?
Yeah, during the appraisal of your housing officer, you can say, what have you done this year in order to encourage housing involvement, and that will be part.
Yeah, I'd expect that to happen.
Great, thank you.
Assembly Member Gavron, you have a
I just wanted to ask, resident support officers, do they live on the estates?
Actually, I don't know if some live on the estate. Many of them, I think about half, are from Southwark, and many of them come from either are or come from families who are council tenants. But I don't know if they live. I think there are very few who live on the estate that they work on. We try not to do that.
Try not to do that.
Yeah, it can be quite awkward for them to be on the same estate, living on the same estate that they've got a professional responsibility for.
Mm. It's interesting because it used to be a very good model in the past.
Yeah, I think it depends what the role is. We have some. I mean, some of our estate cleaners live on the estates, but we've got. I think my colleague mentioned that we're expected to deal with. Expect resident officers to deal with things like neighbour disputes. That is just one example that will be very tricky if you're on an estate, and particularly if your family's on the estate. That can be awkward and difficult. So it just keeps it very clean between the role that you have to play as a professional. We want professionals to be accessible, but they still need to be professional. And I guess family ties, which always complicate matters.
Okay.
I wanted just to welcome the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development to the meeting. Thank you very much, James, for coming in. You're always very generous with your time with us. We will have some questions for you shortly, if you can carry on waiting for a little while. I wanted to move on to the two housing associations that we have, and starting with Paul Hackett. You're chair of the G15 as well. There seems to be a lot of discussion, it came from our residents as well, of housing associations using sort of more modern methods of engagement with people, possibly to the exclusion of more traditional ways, but also potentially there might be some benefits to that as well. I know the G15 and various housing associations are looking at that, and your own housing association has some things to talk about. So can you tell us how you're using digital technology to make improvements, and what the limitations of that might be as well?
Okay. Actually, can I just mention that our approach in relation to the housing officer is actually the opposite of the approach taken by the local authorities, interestingly. So we've adopted a patchless model whereby work comes in via a taxi rank system. So the first available housing officer carries out that particular task. Most incoming demand comes via our contact centre, which is a more modern method of dealing with incoming inquiries. So 80% of incoming inquiries are dealt with by the contact centre in the first instance, and that's about having good information. So the bedrock of this is having a really good customer relationship management system that records every interaction. What we then do is we have specialist teams. So the comments about generic versus specialist, the sector has been round the loop a few times on this, but we consulted heavily with residents on what they really wanted, and co-created a model with them that we felt would give them the best outcomes. And that model is effectively to have specialists dealing with things like financial inclusion, income collection, lettings and allocations, neighbour nuisance, and these are people who are highly trained and skilled in those specialisms, and they will be dispatched to deal with a particular inquiry. If the tenant wants to speak to a housing officer, we give them the choice and say, who would you like to? They can speak to their housing officer if they want, or they can speak to the first available housing officer. And interestingly, 99.9% of tenants would rather speak to the first available person. Because what they
is that a good thing in relation to who they last dealt with?
I think it is, because I mean generally it's a transactional thing. So they want someone to come to their home to deal with a particular query that they're not able to deal with over the phone. And because if you want to speak to a particular person, it may be that they're on holiday, they might have appointments the first half of the week, you may have to wait a week or two. But you can generally see the first available housing officer within a day. So generally speaking, people would rather not wait. And we found that what that does, it actually creates a lot more capacity, because if you can imagine a housing officer covering a patch of 200 homes, you'll have periods of peaks and troughs. What this approach does is it actually matches the incoming demand for contact with the available people. And it's been hugely successful. It's very, very popular with residents and with staff because things happen more quickly. But the key to making this work is having really good CRM data so that every single contact has to be recorded. If it's not recorded, it may well as not have happened. So people are highly motivated to complete their CRM. We also have...
Spell out what CRM stands for.
So it's the customer relationship management system. And all of our officers have apps on their mobile devices, so that when they call out to the home, they can transact with the resident, they can carry out the mutual exchange application or look at a rent inquiry, and the data on the app pushes and pulls data from our databases. So it speeds up the way that we can carry out those interactions. It creates confidence with residents because they can see that their inquiry is being dealt with there and then. And when our staff are out in the tenant's home, they can show them how easy it is to use the app and suggest in future they look to use the app themselves, and we can download it onto their device. So we're using technology to try and accelerate the process of providing services within the home. But we are absolutely obsessed by resident engagement. We really believe it's essential that social landlords have effective structures, both formal and informal, because our tenants are captive, they are not able to vote with their feet. If we make bad judgments in the way that we design services, generally it doesn't affect our turnover. We don't get normal market signals that you would do in a commercial organisation, so we have to have ways of establishing whether the services we're delivering are actually effective. So we have a range of different methods, which include many of the traditional ones described earlier on, of a residence strategy group, local panels, procurement panels, etc. And that provides us with really useful forum within which to discuss services and for which we can then be held to account. And we've matched this with the use of better data. So in our view, what we need to do is combine quantitative methods with qualitative. So we gather a lot of data through CRM because all these interactions are all recorded. We gather a lot of complaints data, and we have very good data on the repairs that are carried out within our homes. So this information enables us to identify where services have failed. And we have conversations with our panels about solutions. And we try and pull all this together by adopting a model of what we call co-creation, whereby we look at service design in partnership with residents, using the data to help guide us in terms of the big issues that need to be resolved, but work with residents to come up with the solutions to those problems.
Okay, thank you. We'll have some follow-up questions, but Simon Theobald from Metropolitan, do you want to outline how you're doing similar things?
I think the first thing I'd say is that we're an organisation that's been through a lot of change, and in fact we're right in the middle of the latter stages of a partnership merger. I think that's impacted on the trajectory and transition of our engagement with residents. And I apologise if I keep using the word customer. It's unfortunately my background originally is financial services, so it comes from there. And I know many of our residents fight that. So I think we've got a history of tenant groups from mergers that are still there, and over a period of time, inevitably that creates a certain tension. I think we've also got from regeneration schemes. I've discovered in going out into schemes recently where we've got fairly big regeneration schemes around London. They started out with great fervour and excitement and lots of activity, and were very well structured. Sometimes 10 plus years further on, we are still engaging with a tenant residenting structure that remembers that. And that is difficult from point of view of moving on into different technology, because they remember all of those real active groups, fora that were happening at the time of that transition, and maybe stuff has changed. So if I look at how change has affected us, I think it's affected us in that we still have a housing structure and a neighbourhood investment structure that are separate but work together. That's going through a period of change at the moment, and we're looking at how we do that, and I'd certainly echo what people have said about patch sizes. Our patch sizes, both outside London, could be very large geographically, as well as reaching up to sort of 700-800. We're wanting to move that down to a far more realistic size. I think the phrase I would use, we would like somebody going up the garden path once a year. That would be our aspiration. I think there's also a tension between centralisation and localisation. We run, as Paul does, we run a call centre, and again, some of our tenant groups will remember where we were localised around offices, and I think there's a tension there. So I think we have a drive at the moment to look at our tenant groups, which again are structured in a very similar way. We have a governance structure that's around a board representative and a tenant group, a customer group representing the whole of our regions. We then have a scrutiny group which aligns to our risk register and audit structures. And I think we're looking at how they change over the next few months. For example, we started to involve them in how we develop CRM. So actually starting to ask what are the key questions we should be asking? How do we want data to be used? How do we want data to be, use the word carefully, exploited so that it can be delivered to frontline? And again, to follow the question about frontline, I think we're looking very carefully at how we're going to blend that role, that separation currently between what we think of as community investment, where it is working around genuine social value, compared to the tenancy management, and the sort of bridge role that goes into social care. We also have a fairly large care and support arm, so there's quite a challenge there where we've got housing officers who are acting as that bridge between adult social care and housing management, and that can be quite a challenge. So I think technology comes in there, looking at how we would want to really harmonise the data we have. We've just done some really interesting work around looking at triggers from repairs, safeguarding, ASB, the tenancy arrears situation, putting those together and saying, well, what does that tell us? Are there early warning signals? Are there triggers that we can use? So yeah, technology is going to be a big thing. Final thing I'd say, I think, is that standing back and looking at our TRAs, 21 odd TRAs, I think they probably have a great link to heritage, and there are some fantastic voices out there. I've sat with groups who can talk to me about what life was like 30 years ago, and they're still passionate, and I applaud that enormously. I think if there are groups that still want to do that, we'll support them to the hilt. The challenge is there's a whole range of Gen X, Gen Y millennials who will not want to take time out of their working weekend and evenings to do that. And it's how do we reach as many as possible? So we're starting to set aspirations for completely closed, and the transformation and pace of dialogue has been dramatic, absolutely dramatic. We have a customer services group with 1,200 members.
You discuss confidential information on that?
No.
Okay.
No. But it's closed, so it's completely closed in those groups, so we can drive that down. What would be fantastic is we move that in that type of voice structure for our members, rather than just relying on surveys, despite the fact they're extremely effective.
Thank you. We've had a very comprehensive discussion that's gone on slightly longer than I meant it to, but I do have one or two questions arising from that. I'm really sorry. First of all, I'll ask them both at once, actually, just to save time. You both talked about scrutiny groups, procurement panels, things like that. How do you select the residents who go on that, or do the residents select who goes on these scrutiny groups? And the second question is, Simon, you described quite eloquently the need for some housing officers to be bridges to social care, and so how do you deal with the challenge of, yes, you want to be efficient and give people a housing officer as soon as possible and put them through a CRM if you can, but if there's a complex case where knowing the resident is important, do you give them different ways of engaging? How do you deal with complex cases in a call centre type situation?
A bit on that.
Yeah. Shall I do scrutiny first?
Yeah, I'll do this safeguarding bit.
On the scrutiny side of things, it is self-selecting. I think that is one of the issues, as has been alluded to earlier on, about panels, is how representative they are. We merged in May last year, and we've just finished creating our resident governance structure, which is multi-tiered. We're really pleased that 8% of the people that we've recruited were born after 1981. So it feels like real progress compared to often the demographic is generally a lot older, a lot whiter. So we really are working hard to try and create more diversity. But those groups, because it requires a lot of commitment, lots of meetings, it does tend to be people who are not working. So generally they're retired, and they've got the time and energy to put into this work. But we do find the contributions they make absolutely invaluable. And the way we ensure that we don't just end up with ideas being captured by one demographic or one interest group is to go back to what I was talking about before in relation to data, that if we've got the quantitative information, this is what the data is telling us. There are a number of different solutions and ideas. We want your feedback and your ideas and input. Let's work together on this. And the approach to rolling out changes is very much about testing and piloting before we roll out. So the patchless model I talked about before was co-created with residents and with staff, actually, and was a very incremental rollout. And we learned an awful lot from trying it in different regions, then gradually rolling it out across the whole business.
And so how do you deal with complex cases then? Do people have a different way of contacting you than the call centre? They have a different number to call if they need a named housing
What
officer?
we do, we have this generic approach works because, the patchless approach works on the basis that we have specialists who deal with particular issues, and within each region we have 2 tenancy support officers that deal with residents with complex support needs. But the idea is this is something which has a beginning and an end. It's about signposting and bringing in other agencies. It's not a forever service. So, and their referrals come in from other housing staff. And then for issues like antisocial behaviour or nuisance, there may be very complex cases in relation to that. Every individual, where there is a case, within 24 hours they get a plan. They have a named, dedicated officer that deals with that case, again, until it reaches the end. So we try and operate as efficiently and effectively as we can and a lot of this comes down to customer care training for staff. One of the really big bits of feedback we've had from residents is we want to feel that we are respected, that staff care, they're committed to helping us, and therefore we want to be our cases we manage very, very efficiently. So we want to be kept informed. That's the single biggest thing. If things change, and of course things always change, whether it's with repair cases or with ASB, the key thing is keeping us informed. So staff training is a really big part of that.
Simon?
So complex cases, we invest a lot in safeguarding training, and that's not just the nuts and bolts, that's about a cultural approach. It's about understanding that safeguarding doesn't just belong in the care and support world, it's absolutely part of general needs. We have specialists in our call centre so that they can manage the transition of cases very carefully to allocated experts, so very similar to Paul. I think as well we would look very carefully about of losing those dedicated relationships on the ground. We've had some real successes where local services officers are so well connected to some of those cases that without that I think that would be difficult to achieve the right outcome for those customers at risk. So I think that's pretty essential.
And the scrutiny bodies?
Yeah, absolutely self-selected. I came into this 2.5 months ago going with a mindset that said, well, I would love to know how representative the group is, and that meant I didn't believe it was. I was really surprised when I got to our national group. The age range goes from very early 20s up to retired. It's pretty well diverse. It may need a balancing around geography. We're continuing as ever to recruit. I think our scrutiny group, which is more around challenging us and working with us to against those key drivers of our risk register, I think they probably are a little more self-selected from customers who are retired or able to give more time, because I think they generally are giving a huge amount of time there in running projects.
When you say self-selected, do you mean people who apply for the job or people who are elected by their peers?
They would apply, and then the group itself would interview and appoint.
Okay, and is that the same for you, Paul?
Yeah, so our panels are self-selected, and then scrutiny projects, it would be the resident strategy group that then would select people from within that group to run a particular scrutiny project.
When you say self-selected, you mean they apply and they're chosen by the organisation to be suitable?
They're chosen by the residents group, but it's an application. It's not a democratic process.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've taken far too long on that. Assemblymember Gavron is going to now tackle some questions on complaints.
But it's there's quite a big overlap, I think, with what we've been talking about, especially with Simon and Paul. If I could ask Simon first, and pick up on some of the stuff you've said, of course, if you want to, but what procedures have you got in place to absolutely ensure that complaints are dealt with appropriately, adequately, timely fashion?
We've sat since sort of February this year. We've taken a really hard look at complaints. We came together back end of last year from 2 separate divisions. So we had a housing division and we had a care and support division. The 2 are now fused into customer services. And I think once you do that and you label it customer services, you immediately say, look, we've got an aspiration here that dealing with feedback and dealing with complaints becomes a top priority. Our stats were not where we wanted them to be. The numbers were running very high. Inevitably, you expect a huge amount around repairs. So we've taken a pretty hard look at how to do that, how to change that, with a number of pilots and processes that are in place at the moment to make that more effective and to close the loop better with customers, residents, and to make sure that we are going back and feeding back as to you know, what are we doing, what have we done. So that would involve things like...
What way do you feed back?
Feeding back often directly through... So if we've got a complex complaint, I mean, we will make sure that we visit as far as we can do. So that does mean face-to-face visit. It means knocking on a door. So we would say our approach would be our accountable heads. Once we're getting to a complex complaint, our accountable heads should be in dialogue and making sure that we've resolved that complaint satisfactorily. And that applies as well when we go up to the sharp end, which is where we put ombudsman complaints. Exactly the same process. We would say we would be developing a stronger relationship with the ombudsman, so we're demonstrating that we are closing down complaints properly and adequately and making sure that we're resolving them.
Right. So if somebody bypasses you or isn't satisfied and they go to the ombudsman, and then you're defending yourself to the ombudsman.
I think it would not so much to be defending, but be working with to get the right resolution. I think that's very much about...
Working with to get a resolution.
Yeah, because inevitably the ombudsman process is going to operate above stuff anyway. It will. That doesn't stop us during that process. We would obviously continue to work through that to get the right resolution. So I wouldn't say it as a defence. No, it's about making sure we're learning from that as well. So, for example, we have a complaint panel currently led internally. I would hope that we would move that fairly rapidly into having customer representatives on that panel. So that looks at complex cases and makes sure that we're applying the right resolution as timely as possible.
And what about something that's more general to an estate? I mean, do you have estate visits and invite tenants to come and...
So we would have
residents, so that they can all be party to pointing out things. And
yeah. So that would happen through again a range of activities. So if I look, for example, at older people's services, we would often have a nominated contact there within the scheme, who would be literally dealing with an estate or a scheme inspection. Our housing managers and housing officers will do regular walkarounds. We'll have what we call repair surgeries, so they'll be notified in the estate office, so there'll be a surgery. Same would apply in care and support. Care and support, we would have scheme walkarounds as well, so that we and where we want to take that is to start to cross-fertilise, so that I think it would be, we have a huge number of our residents in our social and affordable housing who could add huge value to our care and support services, could actually become our own panel of sort of experts by experience. So we're wanting to start to do more, and I think very much as part of the proposed partnership, we know Thames Valley have a very strong estate inspection model. So I think assuming that partnership comes to fruition and happens, I don't think we'll reinvent the wheel. We're already going to do a pilot in a South London area. We will look at their model and how effective that is, and how can we roll that out across our other estates.
The good thing about estate inspections is that, if you return in a timely fashion, everyone can see whether the work's been done or not together, and how it's been done. So, can I ask, if you were to be more transparent, sorry, it's not put very well, but if you wanted to have the most transparent and effective way of operating it, how could you see improvements?
Yeah, I think we can make moves to involve our residents far more, as Paul has outlined, at early stages of system design, and sharing more transparently, therefore, where we're heading. I think what probably has happened in the past, we may not have brought people in as early as we could do. I think the other thing we've got to do about transparency is turn it both ways and say, take for example a procurement approach. I think it would be unfair to say to a customer, you will be required to be involved in every possible stage of this right through to the... It's saying, well, where would a customer or resident add the most value? Where can you deliver that value to that process, rather than pulling huge demands on people through all stages? So I think it's about sharing more with more of our resident groups about that journey and where we're heading. So a strategic partner maybe.
Can I ask the same questions of you, Paul?
Yes, complaints. We're really big on complaints. We had a massive problem 9 years ago. We merged last year. One of our legacy organisations, which I worked for from 2009, had a really big problem. We were in regulatory supervision because our performance was so poor, and our complaint service was particularly poor. So we created a new resident governance structure, and we redesigned the entire process with residents, and that was it's a long time to get right, but it does involve every resident having the opportunity, if they want to have their appeal heard by a resident chaired panel, so 2 residents plus a member of the customer experience team plus another external industry expert if required, or they can have their appeal heard by staff. It's up to them. Having a process by which case management has been standardised, that we're able to keep people informed, because often complaints will have a number of elements to them. So satisfaction with the complaint handling process improved massively. In 2015, DCLG funded a study by University of Westminster into the way that we run the organisation, and particularly how resident engagement has had an impact. And they estimated that we saved £180,000 between the sort of high point of our poor complaints management to where we ended up in 2015, on the basis that we were getting fewer repeat complaints, fewer issues. We were nipping things in the bud more quickly, and there's a tangible financial benefit to that, but equally a massive impact in terms of satisfaction with the complaints process, satisfaction with complaints outcome, and overall satisfaction with the organisation. So that's one really good example of working with residents. So rather than us presuming as officers to know what would work, rather saying, in the way that we handle complaints, what are the most important things to you? And this issue about feeling confident in the process, being kept regularly updated on what was going on, having the opportunity for residents to hear the complaint, all of these things were really important. We merged last year in May. We've had a bit of a spike in complaints. I think inevitably bringing 2 organisations together puts on additional organisational stress, as we've heard from Metropolitan, but the model we have, we think, is a really good one, at the end of the day, complaints are something you can learn from. So we have our operational performance team reviews all complaints, and they make sure that we act upon any feedback if there's anything that we could learn from.
And if you could, again, in terms of, see a way to be as transparent as possible, what would you like to see?
I think transparency is really important, and we've been working with the National Housing Federation on a national approach to our offer to tenants. And as part of that, we wrote to the Prime Minister to suggest that there should be, or that the sector wants to propose a more transparent way of working. We think trust is absolutely key. And building that trust, giving residents the information they need, being transparent, empowering people by having high quality data about the way that the housing association is managed is important. So we would like to see the evolution of a transparency charter that could be adopted by housing associations, which in turn then might translate down into service standards. So we think that's probably the right way to do it, to have a high level set of principles against which boards would have to be held accountable, and then the detail of how it would work, because there's a lot of diversity within the sector, would need to be worked out and agreed locally. And I think Martin Cave, when he wrote his report over a decade ago about resident engagement, every tenant matters, he was very keen on this idea that the primary relationship should be between the landlord and the tenant, and it's about agreeing what will work locally, and that certainly echoes our experience that we shouldn't presume. We should listen to what the most important things are, engage residents in the design of structures, and then be held accountable for our performance.
That's interesting. Can I just ask you, since, I'll ask both of you quickly, since Grenfell, have you come under more pressure?
I think Grenfell changed everything for the housing association sector, the whole housing sector. We're acutely aware of the need for residents to have a louder voice. It's changed the way that landlords look at fire safety, and we're engaging our residents in how we look at our complex buildings to make sure that the solutions we come up with are not top-down solutions, but they understand what the options on the table are, and that very much reflects the Hackett view of having different layers within the fire safety arrangements, and making sure that residents understand how those are supposed to work, so that if they do have concerns, there are avenues through which they can escalate those issues.
I'd echo that, and I think as well in a sort of wake-up call around clarity of communication, not just in fire safety of existing blocks, but also in how when we're coming into a project. So, if we have a big project for delivery of heating, for example, that may take some months to deliver, it's about starting that conversation with residents early enough and continuing the conversation and the dialogue right way through to conclusion. I think that, and you could say that's very much from the Hackett Review and CDM principles. So, but actually just making sure that we are really delivering proper communication throughout the process.
Interesting. I just want to say, something that's been absent so far, may come in, is that the various officers, customer relations, resident support, housing managers, working collaboratively with other services, like fire service, like social workers. I just very quickly, presumably this does happen, you just haven't mentioned it.
I mean, for us, probably the biggest example of that interagency working would be our tenancy support officer, where if somebody's identified and referred to these officers who has a particular support need, it could be an issue like hoarding, for example, a complex issue to resolve, that we would assess the case, and we would work then in a multi-agency way to try and support and help somebody overcome their issues. So that's fundamental to the way that we work. Our work as well on antisocial behaviour and nuisance, we work very closely with our local authority partners, we work closely with the police. No agency on its own is able to fix all of these problems. We've got to work together collaboratively.
Echo it. We've
Okay, yeah, fine. It's okay, I thought that would be the case. Can I just turn to you now, James, and just ask you what your view is of the Hackett Review's recommendation about setting up a body with very strong enforcement powers to deal with complaints?
Yes, thank you for the chance to speak to the committee this morning, and I think we would very strongly support any moves as a result of Hackett, or indeed any of the other changes that the government are considering through the Green Paper, for instance, which we hope is going to be published before the summer, to strengthen residents' voices and to make sure there's a kind of clear route for residents to escalate concerns quickly. I mean, the Mayor is going to be responding formally in detail to Hackett's recommendations, but what we've set out already is a few steps that could be taken immediately, we think, to give a clearer route for residents to raise their concerns. So whether that's ensuring they can escalate individual complaints to the Ombudsman more straightforwardly and quickly, rather than having to go through a designated person or wait a particular amount of time. And I remember as a councillor a few years ago when the new system was introduced, whereby you had to go through a designated person or wait. It actually just created confusion for residents about how you escalate those complaints to the Ombudsman, and bluntly meant that some people gave up because you would try and do it and the process was complicated, and so people would back off it. And I think any system for complaints being investigated needs to be accessible, simple, straightforward, so that people can access it. The second of three things which we've suggested so far is about changing the way in which complaints can be put to the regulator of social housing, because at the moment there's quite a high bar, we feel, for residents' complaints to be considered by the regulator in terms of serious detriment being the hurdle which they have to cross, which means that actually the number of resident complaints that get looked at by the regulator is very low, and we would like to see that change. And then third, we think there should be a commissioner for social housing residents on a national level, and the reason for that would be that to keep an eye on what regulations and laws are being suggested and implemented at a national level, and make sure there is someone who would be, in our recommendation, actually based on feedback from Londoners themselves, someone who's a social housing tenant themselves as that commissioner, to make sure that legislation is fit for purpose. So those are a few key things that the Mayor suggested. But I think running through it is this idea that there has to be a way that residents can easily access a system whereby they can escalate complaints quickly and effectively if they want to. And I think whatever system nationally is proposed over the coming months and years to improve tenants' voices, we want to make sure they're as effective as possible. And I think the test will be, if you have a resident who has a complaint on an estate, how do they make sure they get listened to? And we need to check that whatever system is proposed is robust and does actually achieve that.
And that if necessary, followed up with some sort of enforcement.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, okay. Has anyone else got a point?
Somebody over Mr. Eshalomi has a question.
I just wanted to come back to ask in terms of, you cited resident walkabouts and engagement. And I think it's right to say that if we do get to a stage where a resident has to go to the Ombudsman, essentially the complaints mechanism locally has failed. I've recently come off the council, having been a councillor for 12 years in Lambeth, and I think, again, there are a number of us who've sat on the councils, and I think one of the things, the top complaint I received was housing complaints in terms of residents not getting the replies from their, whether it's housing management, different RSLs, and even the council sometimes. So in terms of those walkabouts, what difference are you offering in terms of making sure they're actually advertised well in advance? One of my bugbears about walkabouts was the fact that they were advertised for slap bang in the middle of the day when residents were at work. Not all residents are sitting at home watching daytime TV. A lot of them have full-time jobs. I think the other thing as well was, ensuring that some of those walkabouts are in the evenings when you can actually see things like broken lights, because you can't see that during the day. So I just wanted to know what additional mechanisms you have in terms of making sure those walkabouts and your complaints mechanisms are actually fit and working for the residents. To all of you.
Yeah, maybe not all of you. Those of you who wish to speak. Sorry, we're really short of time.
If I can pitch in on the community walkabouts, we've elevated the status of estate walkabouts to ensure that a wider group of partners are involved. So the local police officers, fire brigade, council teams, as well as our housing managers. So it's really important that there's a wide focus. We advertise it well in advance for residents of the estate to attend, or the community, and we make sure that we alternate the times between late afternoon and early evening. Early evening is important at the start of autumn when lighting problems become more have a bigger impact for residents, because you don't want to be walking around in pitch dark. So we found the engagement with that type of walk around the area has improved as it's become publicised and as we've fed back on the improvements we've made. The other thing we've done is devolved a budget to the residents themselves so that they have the say over, it's not a huge budget, but over improvement projects they'd like to see on their estates. So things like cycle racks, improved lighting, better notice boards all help to make people connect with one another more effectively. So it's been a positive part of resident engagement, and something that people can join in and leave as they wish, it doesn't impose a big burden on residents to administer.
That's really, really great to hear.
Okay. Thank you. If we move on to David Curtin now, who has some questions about other aspects of resident.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and good morning. So I'd like to ask all of you, but you don't all have to answer, because I know there's a lot of you, about resident involvement in decision making. So first of all, I mean, in your experience, what are the areas where social housing residents should be able to make direct decisions on, and what areas do you think the landlords are best to just get on with making decisions by themselves? So who would like to answer first? Yes, Simon, thank you.
Well, the answer to your final point is pretty much nothing, as in residents should be involved as far as it is possible, and of course the conversation will probably be about the appropriate mechanism for involvement in everything that affects their lives. I think that's our starting point.
Okay.
Key appointments. This gentleman was appointed with resident input. We're going to be talking about the next tier beneath Steve shortly, and we'll definitely be involving residents in the selection of an operations director and a resources director who'll be reporting to Steve. So I think key appointments is the first thing I'd make observations about. In the Almo context, the chair of the board of the Almo is an appointment where absolutely residents have to have a voice in that process. But I'll pause and invite other colleagues to come in on procurement and other issues that I'm sure you have an interest in.
I'll say something about procurement then and major works particularly. So we in Southwark would, as a matter of routine, ask residents on things like major refurbishment of their block to get involved, ask them about I think it's a combination of information giving. So why are we thinking of doing what we're thinking of doing? What do you think about what we're thinking of doing? And then getting to some of the options. I would just say it's not straightforward at all. Residents will have often very different views about what they would like to happen to their blocks. Sometimes it's because some people are leaseholders and some people are tenants, and sometimes it's nothing to do with that. It could be other issues. So there's getting clarity and getting fairness is not always straightforward, and it's not always a matter, I think, of saying, well, most people wanted X. It can be more complicated, and I think that we're probably all going to say similar things about involving residents. I think where it's always difficult, it remains very, very tricky, and we ultimately have responsibility to maintain our buildings and make sure they're safe. So we couldn't have a situation where, for whatever reason, residents decided they didn't want to have something that we thought was essential for a building. But the important thing there, I think, is to explain. We just need to explain the process, why we're doing what we're doing, and what we can't duck out of is our responsibilities for safety and for maintenance of buildings. But by and large, pretty much everything. And I think people have talked about transparency. What we want to do at the right level, either talking to people or putting it on our website or writing to people, is let people know what we're thinking, why we're thinking it, and invite comment. And then importantly, as has been mentioned, go back and say, okay, we've listened, and this is how we've listened, and this is what we're doing next.
Okay. If I could come to Paul from Optivo, I think I understand your residents are involved in procurement in your organisation. How does that work, and what difference has it made to Optivo?
I think it's made a huge difference to us in terms of specifying what the work will be in the first place, in terms of interviewing and selecting a contractor, and then right through to project management and scrutiny of the contract. We found that it really helps drive value for money. And I think one of the really big takeaways for us, and this was identified in the University of Westminster report that I referred to earlier on, they identified £2.7 million of savings overall, the bulk of which were from procurement. And I think what our residents have really helped us to do is to identify areas where we potentially are over-serving. So it's about finding that sweet spot, neither under nor over-serving, in order that everything that we are procuring and everything we're delivering, residents genuinely want and value. And that there's a whole range of different things from life cycles, product specification, design, down to the way that repairs and maintenance are delivered, which are really significant to residents. And it's quite dangerous to presume that we know as officers, even if we've got all the data that might tell us a particular sort of pattern of behaviours or preferences. It's always important in our view to actually test that on residents and just check in that our assumptions are right. And on numerous occasions we've found that an awful lot of value has been added when we've been made to rethink things that we just assumed.
So this idea of over-serving, has that sort of enabled you to save money?
It has, yeah, that's driven significant efficiencies.
Yeah.
We developed a new customer service offer side by side, which was really clear about what we will do and what we expect residents to do, what we won't do. And that's then fed into repairs and maintenance contracts and other service contracts. And that saves significant amounts of money, but also, at the same time, actually increased resident satisfaction. We think the reason for that is about clarity. It's very easy for mission drift to creep in, but actually I think a really good relationship between a landlord and tenant is one where there's clarity, there's an agreement at the beginning what can be expected, and both parties then work within that agreement.
Oh, fantastic. It sounds like a great example of where they've you work together to improve things. But has anyone else got any examples of specific times or issues where resident involvement has helped improve service delivery and or anything to do with
I'll come back on one if I might. So thinking about service support for older people, and so something slightly different from if you like mainstream management and repairs, where actually the expertise of one of our leading involved residents, who was himself a sheltered housing officer by profession, led to him being involved pretty much from the start to the finish in terms of specifying what that service should involve. And again, I think picking up Paul's point, avoiding some of the overcomplications we as officers might have introduced from someone who knew from the front line what mattered most to residents, and then through to the selection of the successful organisation. So I think involving residents from the beginning, I think that's been said several times already, is important, but tailoring people's skills and expertise to the right type of involvement, I think, in that case, proved very beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
I think if I might come in on this, Chair. I mean, obviously, we're in a slightly different position here at the GLA, as in we don't deliver housing services, we're not a landlord. But I just think in terms of your general point around involving residents in policy decisions and so on, it's been very important to us over the last couple of years to involve residents as we've been developing policy. And actually our approach to engaging tenants and leaseholders and other resident representatives has been through a lot of meetings to help people be involved in the production of that policy. So with the estate regeneration good practice guide being a good example of that, where as well as the formal responses and the petitions to the consultation itself, there's also quite a lot of proactive, quite detailed engagement of residents through roundtables, bilateral meetings, to meetings which were held on estates to make sure we got views directly, and other ways of engaging people. And that was really helpful for estate regeneration, good practice guide. We've engaged people around the housing strategy. We're going to be engaging groups around our response to the government's green paper on social housing when it comes out. So I think a real focus for us is around, I don't know what phrase is, maybe it's called a popular phrase at the moment is co-production, but that's, us producing our policy with residents and making sure they're involved and we can test the ideas off them and then improve them as appropriate. So I think involving tenants and leaseholders and other representatives in the actual production of our policy is really important for us, for the Mayor in City Hall.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, but just if I can come in on that, it's just so one of the things that Hammersmith has done, in particular around estate regeneration, so a commitment from the administration to make sure that if there are proposals for regeneration redevelopment, in particular where there are occupied buildings, that it's only done with residents' consent. So the administration set up a small housing commission to look at the various ways that could be implemented, and the kind of conclusion of that was similar to have an estate regeneration policy, which is also linked, if we can do it, to a restriction on the title, so that the borough solicitor has to, before any land can be disposed of within the HRA, has to be assured that the estate regeneration policy or estate development policy has been specifically followed. And so we're now in the process of setting up a series of steering group panels with residents and independent experts to develop that policy and what form that should be. It probably will involve ballots as part of that.
Sorry to interrupt. We've looked at. We are trying to restrict the terms of reference of this investigation to management complaints up to major works, but short of demolition, for quite specific reasons, because it's a whole big can of worms and a very interesting topic. But if we can stay off that. The committee has looked at it quite recently as well.
Enough discussion about why this particular block should get the good window frames this winter rather than next winter. Then people were very sensible about it, and residents would themselves make very good priority decisions. And I just wondered whether you have experience of involving residents in, I just gave that example of window frames, but it could be something else. Prioritisation, involving residents in it.
Short answer would be yes. Over the period of the Decent Homes programme, which of course has ended, those very factors were discussed in terms of the requirement, which I think every local authority in my experience followed, to publish a programme setting out in which year certain blocks, certain estates would have certain works carried out. Understanding that vulnerable households, older tenants, the case for renewal of windows or any other significant investment would have a payback in the early years was very significant. And I think residents accepted, when presented with the options, why we were prioritising certain blocks, certain estates before others. So yes is the short answer to your question. I think we do have experience of that. I think we're now seeking to develop a new asset management strategy where, again, the transparency of decision making picking up some of Michael's points.
And just one question: have any of you? It's a hobby horse for me. I've just got to get in. Have any of you tried to take down your no ball games and introduce a ball games pitch in your estates?
You know, that is something that I've been in 3 different councils and looked at, and it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, really, what you can't do on estates. So yes, I've certainly done that, but I wouldn't. But I equally know that if you walk around Southwark estates, they're amongst the most asked for signs from our residents. So the conversation with residents about, well, where can young people, or indeed of any age, but where can people go and kick a football about, means we've got to have somewhere, and then we can signpost people towards them. But it comes back to this, I think, and with an earlier answer, it's absolutely right and proper that we ask residents questions and we listen to them, but we get conflicting answers. And sometimes we have to make a decision, and the ball game one's a good one. Residents ask for no smoking, ball game, well, not smoking is statutory now, but all sorts of signs preventing things happening, and they are quite keen to see it. And sometimes that's where they spend their money that we give them on devolved budgets. They like to put signs up telling people what they can't do. So we try to get into a conversation about that and see if we can say what people can do. Dogs will be another example, and it goes on.
We have very, very strong policies about play areas for children and young people on our new estates, but we've got to deal with the existing ones, and all of you are dealing with the existing ones, so I wanted to get that in.
Yeah, I think people feel very strongly about their signs, and often they had a campaign or the tenant and resident association spent what they see as their money, and in fairness it is, comes from rents, on putting those signs up. And, you know, you're not going to take them down very easily.
There's all that car parking area, you can always put something up. There's always a way. Anyway.
I have one final question in this section to Michael from Southwark again. We've been told that TMOs do well in terms of performance, and this is where residents are directly making more or less all the decisions. I think Nikki's point about the ability to make the difficult compromises, if you kind of just put people in the room and get them to discuss it, might be a good one there. But do you agree? I mean, the figures I've got say 70% of TMOs outperform the local authorities they're based in terms of housing key performance indicators. Do you find that in Southwark?
Yes, straightforwardly. And the acid test is that they have to have continuation ballots, and the continuation ballots in Southwark have very high turnout and very high support for continuation.
What's high turnout in that context?
So 70-80%.
Wow.
Yeah, and a similar vote in favour of continuing. I mean, there are some exceptions, but by and large, the support for TMOs is strong, and by and large, their residents are satisfied with their services.
Thank you. Right, we're moving on to some questions to the Deputy Mayor. Tom is starting out with some questions about government and mayoral actions we might do.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. James, given that housing associations are now the bigger provider of social housing, and one of the biggest providers of social and affordable homes in London, should they have the same statutory obligations as local authorities? Things like FOI, public service obligations, things like that.
I mean, I think it's quite a broad question, but one that I think I have a lot of sympathy with. And I mean, personally, I think the FOI applying to housing associations would be fair. I know there might be other views from housing associations, but I think that would be reasonable. I think that that is something which is being discussed. I think Andy Slaughter MP has a bill in Parliament around that at the moment, which I think is looking to put that agenda forward.
Some issues with some parliamentary shenanigans on.
Is that right? Okay.
Other bills which then had a knock-on impact, sadly. Yes.
Oh right. Okay. That wasn't someone coughing again and just railing it in the way that.
You can just object and they all fall or something.
Is that
like
right?
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't been following the parliamentary procedure that closely, but I was aware that Andy's raised as an issue, which is really positive to get that debated. I think there's a very reasonable expectation that we have close relationships with some of the big housing associations, and increasingly some of the medium and small-sized ones, where we have strategic partnerships, where we effectively give housing associations more freedom in exchange for them getting investment in new housing and meeting housing targets. I think it would be reasonable to expect that partnership to go further, and we are looking at ways that we can make that go further in lots of different respects, whether that's around working more closely together to acquire land, to get more homes built. But I think it's a fair point that the other part of that relationship is around what else housing associations can do to contribute towards the broader agendas that the Mayor wants to promote and that we would like to see happen in London. And I know that we've heard from Paul Hackett around what Optivo has been doing around resident engagement. I think that's something that seeing housing associations taking a lead on resident engagement is something which we'd very much encourage. And I think there is a question around what other broader public sector duties may apply to housing associations. I mean, rather than going through all of them in detail, I would say on the FOI one, I think there is a very strong case for that. And I think it's something that we could look at in terms of particularly in for the next programme, for the next round of funding. What kind of expectations we would have of working with housing associations as partners in terms of what they could do as well as building the homes. There are some expectations in the current programme around around some of the other things apart from building homes that housing associations have to do in order to be our partners. And I think looking at that option around how we could go further in that respect would be worth doing.
I mean, what about, for example, were you to make it a requirement that that you, the housing association delivery partners, adopted the principles of the socio-economic duty, for example? Is that something that you'd consider?
Can you explain that a bit more, Thomas?
So that is, sorry, yes, within the Equality Act, I think is it public bodies or all bodies? Public bodies have to have regard for groups with certain protected characteristics, but one group that has not yet in England and Wales been granted that is based on class or socio-economic group. It has been in Scotland, but not in England and Wales. Is that something that you would consider bringing in unilaterally with the GLA as a condition of funding, for example?
So my understanding is that some housing associations have already incorporated the duty into the work that they're doing in the way that some councils have as well. You're right to point out it hasn't been activated in England and Wales in the way that it has in Scotland. I mean, as I said, in terms of the next funding round, so we're midway through, we're in contract already with housing associations for the current funding programme, but I think looking at the next funding round, that would be a good time to look at whether it would be worth putting duties like that into the conditions of the following programme.
What about things like extending sort of the right to manage? So council tenants, as we know, can establish TMOs. What about? Do you have any thoughts on whether or not that could be extended to? I mean, we've had talk of extending right to buy, which I think some of us would be less keen on, given the implications, the wider implications of that, and the implications for the assets and the ability to invest, the knock-on effect that would have. But do you think that there's a case for extending the right to manage?
I would share your views about not supporting the extension of the right to buy. I think in terms of right to manage, I think, I sort of think back to my experience as a councillor in a previous role, where TMOs, in the vast majority of cases, did really well. I think that there's some cases where they didn't, but actually there were effective ways to respond to that. I think in the vast majority of cases, TMOs do very well, and I think they're quite accountable in that they have the continuation ballots, as was outlined by the guy from Southwark. It is a situation where TMOs do improve the responsiveness and the service for residents in a lot of situations. I think extending that to housing associations is definitely something we should look at.
We've got Can I interrupt and just welcome
yes, of course.
the pupils here from the Dorothy Barley Junior Academy. Hello. You're from Barking and Dagenham, and this is the Deputy Mayor for Housing, and we're asking questions about how people who live in housing that we fund in London from the councils can get involved in managing their own homes.
Well, if we've got a bit, I was wondering if we get some thoughts from housing associations as well on all these matters, FOI, socio-economic duty, and things like extending the right to manage.
Okay. In relation to FOI, the housing associations were recently redesignated as not public sector. And so I would just caution about anything that might lead towards a redesignation as public sector, and therefore bring 60 billion back onto the public financing, 60 billion of debt. So I think that's definitely one issue to consider. We spoke earlier on about transparency. I think there is a real commitment within the sector to be transparent. So I just wonder whether there is a way of achieving the same outcome without running the risk of reclassification, and whether the transparency charter that we talked about that could be adopted by housing associations in order their boards are held accountable for transparency could actually deliver the same material benefits to people on the ground and give residents access to information that they need.
I don't even think this is something that's necessarily specific to housing associations, but I think there's quite a lot of sort of a desire for any sort of organisation that essentially receives an awful, quite a bit of public money, with its outsourcing companies and things like that. If that was still being done by local government or a government agency, it would be subject to FOI, but because now it happens to be done by another organisation, it doesn't apply. And I think a lot of people would see that as, well, why is that the case? Is there a way you think it could be brought in on a sort of voluntary basis with housing associations?
I think the transparency charter could probably do that. I think there's a way that we could get the same outcome. So the charter is still to be worked up. The National Housing Federation are very much promoting this. They called on MCLG that this should be an approach that should be taken forward. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there to provide the same kind of outcomes for residents.
But the socio-economic duty, is Optivo one of the housing associations that already applies that, or would you consider
We're
doing
not. I mean,
it?
we do apply equality impact assessments to absolutely everything that we do. This issue hasn't been raised with me before, but certainly we would be very happy to include that within our equality impact assessments, which are pretty rigorous. So I don't see there being any downside, frankly, to doing that, other than maybe how you'd measure it. But I think, but in principle, absolutely yes.
Any other thoughts on these from the other?
Can I ask a very quick supplementary question? Literally relating to information, the Information Commissioner issued some advice to councils following Grenfell about releasing fire risk assessments so that people could see what the fire risks were in their own homes. This followed up me complaining about this to her as well. She said in that letter that she couldn't make the same request exactly to housing associations because she didn't have governance over you, but she suggested you should look at that advice. Do you know of any housing associations who've made a policy of publishing fire risk assessments since that?
I think all of G15 have agreed that we will make fire risk assessments available where they're requested in an abridged
requested
form.
Though, that's different than publishing.
What we've not done is posted every single fire risk assessment on our website, because it's a little bit like publishing all financial data. The requirement a few years ago that we do that, and we just don't think that's the best way to give people easy and accessible information. What we'd rather do is talk to residents or groups of residents about the fire risk assessment on their building, and that would involve producing a sort of an abridged version that is more accessible in order that people can be empowered. And again, going back to the transparency charter idea, we want to try and embody something within that would include access to information about fire safety.
See, the Information Commissioner did say, don't wait to be asked.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of fire risk assessments in the last year, I'm afraid. Yeah. They're not that inaccessible. But you still say there's no housing associations who've proactively published?
No housing association I'm aware of has put everything on their website, but as I say, all of G15 have agreed that we will make fire risk assessments available to residents that want them. So no one is being denied the access to that information.
Sorry, Tom.
Have you got any thoughts on extending right to manage the housing associations? What implications would that have for you?
Of course, housing association tenants can request a local management agreement. So they have that statutory right at the moment. In 30
it's a right
years,
to request, it's not a right to...
yeah, I mean...
It will automatically be granted if they request it? Or?
In 30 years of attending resident meetings and engaging with residents, I've never had a request to either set up a TMO or to exercise this right. What I've invariably had is questions around service quality, around resident representation in terms of decision making, investment, all these sorts of things. And I think the housing association model is a different model from the local government model. So, if you look at the way that we do resident engagement, we have 3 residents on our board. That's a quarter of our board. We have resident panels. Every single board member is required to attend and allocate a resident panel, so we can triangulate what we do. There's lots of ways in, and I think for our governance model, it works better to have an organisation that's very much focused on co-creating, listening to residents, working with residents, and that's certainly what all the demand that we're getting comes from.
It was something that came up with the residents that we spoke to. I mean, where estates have been stock transferred, is there a preserved right to, in the same sense you've got preserved right to buy, do they retain a right to have a TMO in the same way that they would when they were owned by the council, do you know?
I'd need to double check that,
yeah.
But I'm not aware. I've been involved in a number of stock transfers over the years. I'm not aware of any request ever to do anything, because normally what happens with the transfer ballot is there are agreements put in place for how the governance will work, how representation will work. Residents are balloted on that, and generally those arrangements are the arrangements that prevail.
Simon, do you have any comments on these?
Yeah, no, I think most of it I'd definitely defer to Paul. And again, in the transfers I've seen, I'm not aware of any residual TMO work.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, James.
Say, yeah. And I declare an interest in saying this, but actually where I live used to be a local authority estate and is now a housing association and has a TMO. And I think the TMO was set up when it was still council. So I'm not sure whether the right to manage transferred, but certainly because the TMO is up and running, when it's a stock transfer to a housing association, the TMO continued. So there is an example I'm very closely aware of a housing association estate.
How many others like that there are in that case? That just...
We could try and find out.
Yes, we should try and find out.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, Assemblymember Boff has the next question.
Mr. Burns, in your view, what's the value of appointing a national social housing commissioner to be the voice of social housing tenants, residents?
I think it would depend on what the remit of that commissioner would be. I think there are, I think from a local authority perspective, there are already a number of routes for residents to get accountability, and because it's a democratic organisation, that's the primary accountability is with the local members. So I think and local authorities have a fairly diverse approach and diverse politics, so I think I would need to understand how that would interact with the local politics and how that's set up. I think from a registered provider perspective, I think it could be incredibly useful, as I think James set out. If there's somebody who can represent the different housing association residents and act as their voice in a way that isn't there at the moment, I think that could be one particular role that they could play.
Latham, how do you feel about them?
Yeah, I have similar views to David on this. I think if I'd use the word champion, the championing of social housing and social housing tenants, residents more broadly perhaps, so thinking of what we've already touched on, would be important, an important additional role. I think there is definitely, and the social housing regulator has recently commented on this, a loss with the loss of the TSA of that, let's call it consumer focus, because that's the language that was used previously. But I think the key issue for local authorities, so speaking as a local authority officer, is the relationship between locally elected members and the social housing regulator, or rather the national regulatory body.
Storrar, what's your view?
I think someone who speaks up for social tenants would be great, and certainly I think I would say echo similar points to my colleagues. I think for local government, for local councils who are landlords, there is certainly in Southwark there's a lot of engagement, a lot of involvement from members, not just as cabinet members but as ward councillors. So our residents, I think, feel that they have a pretty solid route into the part of the through the council that runs the council. So there's a route that they can go that isn't the same route that's available in the same way to housing association tenants. So I think it depends what the role is, but I think a strong voice that speaks for and understands the needs, what social housing tenants want would be valuable.
Mr. Murray, how has the government responded to the Mayor's proposals for a commissioner for social housing residents? Has it got anything back?
They've not yet formally responded. I mean, what we're hoping is that they might pick up or reflect the ideas in their green paper on social housing, which has slipped a few times, but we again expect it to be before the summer. We're hoping that proposal might feature in that, and we'll certainly use the green paper as another opportunity to promote it.
Who is the Greater London Housing Commissioner?
So, I mean, as you know,
Social Housing Commissioner.
Well, there isn't one. The idea we put forward is for a national commissioner, and the reason why we've done that is so that it can be a person who would be a social housing tenant themselves to influence and direct national policy around social housing. And I think particularly, as if there is going to be any legislative change around social housing in the coming years, we need to make absolutely sure there is a voice for tenants right there at the heart of government, influencing and directing that policy. And that's why we think someone on a statutory footing with this commissioner role would make sure that the voice of tenants couldn't be ignored as that policy was being developed.
Aren't those arguments equally strong for somebody's voice to be heard at the level of the GLA?
So the idea of the Commission is to influence national legislation, and as we know,
but
legislation is made nationally.
That legislation, but a lot of the a lot of the decisions you make do affect tenants. Why don't you just set one up yourself and prove that it works?
As I explained to your colleague David Curtin earlier on, in all of the policy we've been developing, we've done it with a very close involvement, producing it very much with residents, with tenants and leaseholders and their representatives.
Yeah, I understand that. But it's consultation, but you haven't appointed a commissioner for that job. I mean, wouldn't it be a good idea to just trial run it?
But I think there are two different things here. I think when we're developing the detail of policy, we're in a position and we've prioritised having a large number of meetings and a lot of different situations, some of them small bilateral meetings, some larger meetings, some conferences, some on estate, some at City Hall, a whole different ways of asking, inviting tenants, leaseholders and their representatives to help us to craft policy to make it stronger, better and better reflecting the voice of tenants and social housing residents in London. The commissioner which the Mayor has proposed is very specifically for making sure that voice of social housing residents is at the heart of government and influences legislation and policy decisions which are taken at the heart of government.
How can we ensure that the tenants and residents of housing estates' voice is at the heart of the GLA?
As I say, in all of the development
policy why haven't we got somebody
over the last 2
overseeing
years, we've been doing it hand in hand with residents of social housing and their representatives.
Which tenants' body oversee that strategy?
We've been meeting with a large range of representatives of social housing residents over the last 2 years.
No one particular body responsible. The reason I'm getting to this is you seem to be asking the government to do something you're not willing to do yourself.
Well, as I say, it's a different situation because we are developing policy in London and we're producing it with the involvement of social housing residents. You know, there are lots of different residents' organisations in London. Some are London-wide, like the London Tenants Federation.
These are all very good.
We've been speaking to, and some are more local, and we've been involved in them.
Mr. Murray, the government would argue the same thing as well, that it consults on a wide basis, talks to an awful lot of national organisations, talks to all sorts of players, but you say under their circumstances they need a commissioner, but you won't have a commissioner yourself. Why won't you have a commissioner yourself?
The government's responsibility is for making the laws of the land. And what we're saying is when they're doing that legislation, when they're proposing new bills to go through Parliament, when they're changing the laws that apply to social housing, a social housing tenant should be there to influence the direction of that legislation.
Influence or oversee that the tenant's voice is heard?
To make sure that the views of social housing residents can't be ignored as new legislative proposals are being developed.
And so I would put to you for the last time, who in the GLA, who has been appointed from the tenants to ensure that you are doing the same job, that you are listening to tenants? Or are there, why don't you trust tenants to the same degree that you're asking government to trust them?
We have tenant representatives who have been intimately involved in all of our policies being developed.
But you haven't got a commission.
Whether that is the London Tenants Federation, whether it's other organisations, whether it's local representative bodies.
One rule for them and another rule for us, is that right?
What I'm saying, and I've said a few times now, so it's probably not worth repeating, but there are very different situations. And I set out quite clearly how in a large number of meetings we've involved tenants, leaseholders and their representatives in developing the policy for London. What we want to make sure is that when new legislation, when new bills are being proposed in Parliament, that the voice of social housing tenants through a commissioner can no longer be ignored.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question to that, I guess. And you mentioned that you're going to be looking potentially at some expectations for people receiving your next round of funding, which falls a little bit short of the word requirements, but it sounds like there might be new funding requirements in the footing there. And you said that you would be involving residents in deciding these. No, sorry, you didn't say that you would be involving residents in deciding these requirements. Will you be doing that? Will you be asking residents to come up with potential new funding requirements for your next round of funding? Because I would find that quite exciting as a consultation if you were open-ended about it.
I mean, so just to be clear, when I'm talking about the funding round, we're currently in the 16 to 21 or 16 to 22 programme. The next funding round would be a few years off, so that's not something which is going to be...
So that's not the final allocations, because you haven't allocated all the funding that you have through to...
but it's all within the programme which is currently running. So there has been extra money put into the current programme, but it's on the basis of the current programme as established. So I don't want to give the impression that we have an opportunity right now to add extra expectations, because a lot of the housing providers are already in contract. I think what I would say...
No, but I mean, presumably applications are not closed for all of your money, which is now £4.8 billion, I think.
But it's all within the current programme, which has already been published, and the terms of that, the contracts have been signed, people are in, have started to make agreements on that basis. We wouldn't retrospectively go back and influence those contracts which have already been signed for within the current programme. No,
that's not what I'm asking at all. So
But what I can say is that if we were going to have the opportunity to look at any extra expectations as a result of adding extra conditions into funding agreements in the future, that is certainly something I would want to make sure we involved residents in helping us to think about.
Just to be clear, you've lumped all of the money that you've received from government there into one pot, which you say is already so much in play that you couldn't possibly change any of the conditions for it. Is that right? Because the last bit of that was only announced in the spring. So
what I'm saying is we can't retrospectively add.
No, I'm not asking you to retrospectively do anything that you're a contract for. I know that last summer you announced £1.7 billion of allocations, which partly that's the basis of some of our questions, that so much money of that is going into housing associations. But there isn't any more, has not been directly allocated.
I mean, it depends whether it's allocated under the current programme and current contracts have already been signed.
So I'm only asking about money that hasn't been allocated yet.
What I was going to say, what I can check and come back to with the detail of is about when we could consider any new conditions, when it might be appropriate to do so. What I can say now is that when we would at any point in future consider new conditions, I would want to involve residents in the discussion about what those conditions might involve.
But you're saying that the whole of the programme, the whole 4.8 billion, I hope my sums are right there, is out of bounds in terms of new conditions to do with just things like transparency, perhaps, or whatever.
As I say, a lot of that is in play already, but would you mind if I write to you about that in detail?
Yeah, it'd be really good to know, where we might have an influence. And then my second, final question. The London Tenants Federation have specifically asked us to ask you if you would reform the London Housing Forum. This existed for a number of years under the first Mayor of London. The next Mayor of London abolished it, essentially, quite early on in his term. But they would like to have that. This was a forum that was at City Hall that was constituted from residents' associations that were democratically elected. They believed a good representative body. And have you looked at bringing that back into existence?
So being very straightforward in my response to this, the approach we've taken so far has been a slightly different approach, which is to have a large number of meetings with lots of different groups at lots of different levels to try and involve people. So London Tenants Federation, we involve them, but also lots of other organisations. There are some meetings where they're small bilateral meetings, some where they're roundtables, some where it's workshops, some where it's conferences outside of City Hall. So there's a lot of different ways of involving
Do you
tenants.
publish any of the proceedings from these lots of different ways that you do things? I mean, how can we see what you're being told by residents, for example?
It would depend what the meeting is. Because sometimes if we have a particular residents group or representative group coming in to talk to us, they value the opportunity to talk to us in confidence about their views, and I wouldn't necessarily want to publish detailed minutes of what
others
they've
would like their
told
views on
us.
the record, I think.
That might well be the case, and if we're talking to residents, we can always discuss with them on what basis the meeting is proceeding. I think if there's any other alternatives about new forums to set up and so on, we will always consider that. I mean, I wouldn't commit to it now. I'd want to look at the detail and how that would work. But we're always looking at ways to involve tenants more actively. I mean, I think our approach over the last 2 years, you know, having we had a quick look through our records, you know, 20, 25 plus meetings over the last couple of years with different tenant representative groups. I think having that approach has really strengthened the policy that we've been developing, and I think it has been a really good way of making sure we're engaging people and helping us to develop the different policies of the administration. As I say, if there are other ideas, we'll definitely look at them, but I think our approach has been quite considered, and we've made a deliberate decision to be quite open about the production of policy and to make sure we're doing that in lots of different ways. So rather than there being only one forum through which people can influence it, have lots of different forums at different levels, of different groups. As I say, if there's an alternative proposal, we will look at it.
Thank you for that. I mean, the key thing, I think there is that the residents themselves have suggested this, and obviously we've held a open mic meeting with various tenants groups, and their views there, their recommendations are now on the record as a result of the fact that we will be publishing their views and we'll be making recommendations in this forum as a committee here. So in a way, we're serving that purpose with this one investigation, but we can't do that constantly. We can do this once now, we can do this maybe again in a few years' time. But to have residents' views on the record of what they're asking you to do, their own recommendations on a more consistent basis, does make some sense for them to see what, for everybody to be able to see what residents are asking you for. I appreciate the need to have different types of meetings as well, but at the moment it's hard to see what residents are asking you for unless we go through some of the consultation reports that you've published in response to some of your bigger consultations, but they're by no means comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the consultation reports are quite thorough, you know, and they do set out in quite a lot of detail about, you know, what residents have said about, if I'm allowed to talk about estate regeneration again, yes. about estate regeneration, you know, about all the different policies and the London housing strategy, covering everything the Mayor is doing around housing. So if you look at the consultation report of that and see what lots of different residents and residents groups and respondents have said, and then you have got a publicly accessible record of people's views about actual policy which we're delivering. So if we are coming up with a housing strategy that sets out the Mayor's views on everything to do with housing, estate regeneration and so on, there is a public record there of what residents' views are. So I think, you know, there is clearly a role in what we're doing for publishing detailed views of what people's views are. As I say, some of the other meetings where individual tenants groups come in are, you know, round tables or smaller meetings where they're not recorded in exactly the same way, but actually sometimes that's more appropriate to have a slightly more flexible round table where views come out more organically in that way rather than a formal consultation response. And I think I don't want to say to people there's only one way you can contact us.
I don't think anyone's saying that. So yeah, the limitation with consultation responses is they're only your report on a consultation is only published alongside the decision. So it's after the decision's been made, rather than whilst the debate is still happening that those views are published on. I mean, obviously the individual groups responding can publish their own responses, but there's nowhere that things are collected together. So that's just a limitation.
You're talking about a public record of what people's views are. That record is published
only
and
after the decision
and has influenced, and it's set out how that's influenced changes to the policy. So
yeah, but that debate isn't happening in public meanwhile. So yeah, we're still waiting to see what people have said to you on the final estate guidance, for example. But we won't see that until you publish. You know, the final
ballot funding
the final terms and conditions of those ballots. People have expressed their views, but we don't necessarily know what views you've received until after you've decided how to use those views. So it's a different thing altogether.
So was that a question or?
No, I'm just explaining that consultation responses are retrospective, not as part of a debate. But there you go. Okay, I think that is all our questions, and we should cease the meeting now, I'm afraid. But thank you very much. I do have a couple more bits and pieces to. Do you have a copy of the final bits of the agenda? Thank you. Brilliant. Can I thank our guests? I shouldn't need to be reminded of that. Thank you all for staying for so long. Thank you all for your views. I know there's been a lot of you, but that's been really, really useful for us. Can I ask the committee to note the report in the agenda as background to our questions and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs arising from today's discussion.
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to also agree the work programme as item 6 in the agenda?
Agreed.
And the date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 4th of September at 10 a.m. here in the chamber. There's no urgent business, so that concludes the meeting. Thank you. Yes, of course.